So, welcome everybody to Sigur Center's Roundtable on Taiwan and Indo-Pacific Partnerships and Regional Trends. My name is Richard Haddock with the East Asia National Resource Center. Very happy to be joined by everyone this evening in DC, morning internationally. I wanted to go over just a few logistical items for our webinar conversation. We encourage you to enter questions throughout the session as we will be doing our Q&A at the end after everyone's presentations. You'll see a Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. Go ahead and put your questions there. If you would kindly phrase them as questions, include your name and affiliation so that we can identify you. If you do send it in the chat box by mistake, if you wouldn't mind directing it to all panelists, that will help our staff members make sure that we get to as many questions as possible. This event is being recorded, but don't worry, we don't record the chat and we won't know who's all watching. Instead, we're just going to be recording the panelists and our videos. And that way you can see the panel discussion afterwards if you're not able to watch it all or if you want to see it for a later viewing. That's about all the technical information, so I will pass it on to Dr. Deepa Alapalli, Associate Director for the Sigur Center for Asian Studies, for welcoming remarks and other items. Thank you all for joining us.
Welcome, everyone, from a snowy Washington, D.C. I hope you're all doing well wherever you may happen to be at the moment. I'm Deepa Alapalli, and it's my great privilege to be able to moderate and run the session today. I'm absolutely thrilled to say that we had a huge response of people signing up for this event. Over 220 people signed up. So I think clearly Taiwan and Indo-Pacific partnerships struck a note. Now that Richard has laid out the ground rules, and I just want to say that I would suggest that in terms of the questions, please do start submitting them throughout the event. That way, we will be sure to have them all queued up when we get to the Q&A. Otherwise, I can't promise that we're going to get to everybody's questions if you wait till the last minute. All right. So moving right along to the panel then, when the Biden administration came in, there were some questions about the future of a strong strategic policy on the Indo-Pacific to meet the rise of China. I think such doubts have been largely put to rest with some of the new roles that have been assigned just for the Indo-Pacific in the past few days. The Indo-Pacific Coordinator is a new role at the National Security Council, and I just heard that the ambassador to the United Nations from the US will have a special Indo-Pacific advisor. So this is all very reassuring to US allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. But I have to say that it is a region, when I look at it, it's in a state of flux with some strategic anxiety. So today, what we're going to do is take a kind of regional look by zooming into Taiwan and Taiwan's partnerships with several key countries in the Indo-Pacific: India, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. Each of these countries hold enormous diplomatic and economic potential for Taiwan's regional and international role, more even so given this pandemic-stricken political economy of the moment. So some big questions. Where does Taiwan fit into these countries' foreign policy priorities? How are their policies on Taiwan evolving and changing? And I guess one of the most important questions is, to what extent can these countries delink their approach to Taiwan from the shadow of China? So address these questions and other questions and issues. I have a superb group that I now have the greatest pleasure in introducing. They will each speak for about 12 to 15 minutes, and I'm going to introduce all of them at once, but I'm going to start with we'll start with the speaker who will be speaking first, the farthest from Taiwan, India, and then Australia, New Zealand, and move steadily eastward. So first, I have a friend and one of the most important experts, rising experts from India, who will kick it off, Dr. Sana Hashmi. She's currently actually sitting in Taiwan, so she's got a great perch to approach this topic of India-Taiwan relations. She is a visiting fellow at the Institute of International Relations at National Chengchi University. She's a non-resident fellow at the Taiwan's Next Gen Foundation. I think they probably know how to pick the rising stars that are coming up. She's also she's actually a research a scholar at the Institute for Indo-Pacific Affairs. Previously, she was a consultant at India's Ministry of External Affairs. And she has had a variety of other experiences in think tanks. And so I won't go through all of them, but she has written widely, and she is the author of the book, China's Approach Towards Territorial Disputes, Lessons and Prospects. And right now her project is on situating India in Taiwan's new Southbound policy. She holds a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University. So welcome, Sana, and thanks for coming in and agreeing from, you have early morning there right now, I know. So, all right. Following Sana, we have Jennifer Chang, another rising star. She is at the Global Taiwan Institute. She's a research fellow there. And before that, she was a senior program specialist in the China program at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where her focus was on China's economic, diplomatic, and security role in conflict-affected countries of the Middle East, Africa, and the Indo-Pacific region. She has also worked at other important places like the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. She's written widely, and her most recent article is on Taiwan-New Zealand relations. So she's really well placed for her role on this panel today. Welcome, Jennifer. And last but not least, my colleague, Mike Mochizuki. He holds the Japan-U.S. Relations Chair here. He's an associate professor of political science and international relations. Mike is a well-known leading expert on Japan, East Asia security relations, and he has a long resume that I'm going to just not try to go through, but he's held senior positions before at RAND, at Brookings, and so forth. He is right now completing a book titled A New Strategic Triangle, the U.S.-Japan Alliance and the Rise of China. And since I happen to know Mike quite well, I know that this book will be path-breaking and thought-provoking for sure. So Mike, thanks for joining us, not too far away. All right, with that, let me not spend any more time and then turn right away to Dr. Hashmi, who's going to tell us about India-Taiwan relations and what the prospects are as she sees them. Sana.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, Professor Deepa. And it's my pleasure to speak this morning on India-Taiwan relations under the framework of Taiwan's new Southbound policy. And I appreciate Sigur Center for organizing this timely conference on Taiwan. This is the apt time to discuss Taiwan, its foreign relations, and specifically India-Taiwan relationship, which I consider as one of the most understated and underappreciated set of relationships. So what I'm going to talk about in the next 15 minutes is what is the status of India-Taiwan relationship, what is Taiwan's perspective on its relationship with India, what has been India's approach, and finally, what is the way ahead. So to start with, I would say that the potential of this relationship still remains underutilized. But I believe that last year, 2020 was the year that changed Taiwan's status in the liberal international order. So it was the year when several countries were compelled to talk about Taiwan and notice what Taiwan has been doing. So with respect to India-Taiwan relationship, one silver lining in this age of the pandemic was that there was unprecedented discussion and enthusiasm about Taiwan in India. And because of that, the domestic discourse has visibly shifted in the favor of Taiwan. So amid this recent violent standoff between India and China, we have witnessed how there have been calls to advance ties with Taiwan. But despite these developments, if we look at the scale of cooperation or depth in India-Taiwan relationship, it is less when we compare Taiwan's relationship with other Asian countries such as Japan and even the ASEAN member states. So till the time when the Kuomintang was in power in Taiwan, there was mutual neglect and lack of ambition from both sides. But now, since the coming of a Democratic Progressive Party and Tsai Ing-wen to power, for the very first time, Taiwan is looking towards the South Asian region, with India at the core of its new Southbound policy. But till now, what we have seen that despite positive developments, despite Taiwan's proactive approach towards India, the government-to-government interaction are still limited. But the good thing is that the relationship has acquired a human dimension, and that has put the relationship into the limelight. Now, if I may talk about Taiwan's perspective and how India has become such an important country for Taiwan in the recent years. So Taiwan has begun to refocus its attention to countries other than the ASEAN only from 2016, the Asian countries. So the New Southbound policy was launched when Tsai Ing-wen assumed office. But even before that, during her campaign speeches, she talked about reaching out to countries and diversifying Taiwan's foreign relationship. And the New Southbound policy has been Taiwan's flagship foreign policy initiative since 2016. So there were previous iterations of the policy as well. So Go South policy was first initiated by former President Lee Teng-hui, and it was carried forward by his predecessor Chen Shui-bian. But what has changed with the new Southbound policy is that the geographical scope and the areas of cooperation have been extended, somewhat similar to what India has done with its Act East policy, how Act East policy has come out from the previous Look East policy. So the new Southbound policy holds immense relevance for Taiwan, and it aims to strengthen cooperation and trade and strengthen ties with the major stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific region. So it already has robust ties with the US. Its relationship with Japan are also on track somewhat. But there was a need to reinforce ties with countries which are now part of Taiwan's new Southbound policy. As I say that these countries were not traditionally a part of Taiwan's political thinking before the new Southbound policy came into being. So it is unprecedented that Taiwan has a policy for countries in the South Asian region, and 6 South Asian countries are a part of this policy now, barring Maldives and Afghanistan. So even if Taiwan wants to have a credible South Asia policy and it wants to reach out to the countries of the South Asian region, it has to start with India. So therefore, India is at the core of the new Southbound policy. So this is also important when Taiwan does not have diplomatic ties with any of these countries, especially India. So there is this, there's certainly this synergy in India's Act East policy and the new Southbound policy. So when we talk about these policies, I believe that these policies actually provide a foundation and a long-term framework for these two countries to look towards each other. But we also have to look at it from the perspective of Taiwan's interest in the Indo-Pacific region. So India is an important part of the Indo-Pacific region. India is at the center of the Indo-Pacific, and Taiwan has on several occasions expressed willingness to play an important stabilizing role in the region. So in fact, President Tsai Ing-wen has stated that the new Southbound policy is complementary to the US free and open Indo-Pacific, Japan's partnership for quality infrastructure, and even India's Act East policy. So for Taiwan, focusing on India and cooperation with India will also mean greater visibility and credibility in the Indo-Pacific region. But the problem here is the lack of reciprocity from India's side. So we see positive developments. We have seen several positive developments last year, but there's still more to achieve in this relationship. From India's perspective, its approach is still restricted, despite problems, despite the protracted standoff which is still going on with China. it still adheres to the One China policy. So even though India stopped mentioning the One China policy in its joint statement and other official documents since 2010, and even India's former Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj also asked her counterpart Wang Yi in 2014 that if China wants India to respect One China policy, it has to reciprocate on One India policy. So there was clearly some rethinking on One China policy when Modi came to power. He took a few bold steps and he was familiar with Taiwan. And one of the important developments was to invite Minister Chung Kwang-Thien, the former representative of Taiwan's office in India, representative office in India, along with Dr. Lobsang Sangye, president of Central Tibetan Administration, to his swearing-in ceremony in 2014. But in reality, India still practices the One China policy. It has been cautious in expanding political and even economic ties with Taiwan to some extent. So I believe that all these moves which India has been taking towards Taiwan have symbolic relevance if these are not backed by the concrete actions. So this is what happened between India and Taiwan. So momentum actually began to slow down sometime around 2016 when China began to oppose the increased level of interaction between Taiwan and India, and especially to the visit of an all-women parliamentary delegation from Taiwan to India in 2016. So since then, what we have seen is that nothing much has changed on the ground, and India is still cautious. And in my opinion, this should not be a constraint when we talk about India-Taiwan relationship, because relations with Taiwan could be easily managed while India keeps adhering to the One China policy. In fact, Minister Thien, who has now come back to Taiwan and who is now Deputy Foreign Minister, so before assuming his position when he was in India, he gave an interview to Indian media, and he said that India could have parallel ties with Taiwan and China, and this has been Taiwan's official policy too. So according to, in fact, both sides, the focus is not, and they don't really focus on security and defense ties at this moment, but the emphasis is more on increasing the avenues for cooperation in areas that actually do not harm India and Taiwan's respective equations and interests with China. But in my opinion, I think the bigger hindrance is the boundary dispute, the 7-decade-old boundary dispute that has been going on between India and China. So when Doklam standoff took place in 2017, then the Wuhan summit took place, Mamallapuram summit took place. So there was this realization, or there was this hope among Indian leadership that they might achieve a breakthrough if they go and negotiate with China. They have dialogues at different level. So what I see, if I were to talk about India's approach, what I see is that the Indian leadership wants to achieve substantial progress with the dispute with China before they go ahead and form any coalition to fight China's aggression or even upgrade ties with Taiwan. But as after the Galwan Valley clashes, there is a change in India's approach. We are seeing that there have been efforts to institutionalize the quadrilateral security dialogue, not officially, but it has been, the level has been raised to the level of foreign minister. But with Taiwan, the proactive approach, we aren't really seeing the proactive approach, and it isn't there because if India goes ahead and has a proactive approach towards Taiwan, it will either mean that India will have to face a more belligerent China or an accommodative China. So in both the situations, I believe it becomes difficult for India to maintain a consistent policy towards Taiwan. But even this approach is not very helpful for India. It's not helping India's cause, and there are ample evidences telling us that China does not pay any heed to India's territorial concerns. It does not respect the status quo. And it is in China's interest to keep the dispute alive with India. So China is actually not losing much by keeping the dispute alive, but having a disputed, undemarcated border with a country as aggressive and assertive as China acts as a pressure point for India. Therefore, this is the time for India to rethink its China as well as its Taiwan policy. But having said that, I do not subscribe to this idea that Taiwan could be used as a card against China. Taiwan has its own merit, and the utility of Taiwan will only be unidimensional once the relation with China gets normalized and Taiwan will be neglected again. So this is why I believe that Taiwan should not be used as a card against China by India. And as a scholar of Taiwan studies, I strongly believe we need to get over this. India really needs to get over this ad hocism, this ad hoc approach that it practices when it comes to Taiwan. But this raises the question, is India ready to do something like this? Is India willing to do something like this? In my opinion, considering the current state of the relationship, it will not be immediately possible to bring ties to an advanced level. It will take time, and it will also take a sustained interest and attention of both sides to ramp up ties. So in such a situation, what is the way forward? How do we sustain this momentum that we achieved last year in the relationship? So I think we really need to focus is that right now, India and Taiwan cannot expect to have robust defense ties. And I guess what we really need to start with are the basics here. And this is what I keep saying, that when we talk about India-Taiwan relationship, even the basics are not in place. So first, I believe that number of academic interaction between the two sides need to be increased, that have remained abysmally low. So in order to understand each other better, a case needs to be built for greater people-to-people exchanges, as well as greater institutional cooperation between think tanks and universities. Then it is also important to focus on the economic aspect of the relationship. This is the mainstay of the relations, and there has been a sustained focus. But even after that, I think the potential of the commercial ties are still underutilized. When India has made it clear that it will not be a part of the Belt and Road Initiative in its current form, it might be useful for India to look towards Taiwanese companies and encourage them to take up projects in different parts of India. So Taiwan is an alternative to China in hardware, and we know that how the demand for semiconductors have also increased recently, and India is a leader in software, and I believe that this complementarity can work very well when India is also trying to decouple from the Chinese economy, especially after the standoff. Now, coming to one of the most important topics that we have been discussing these days is how Taiwan is positioned in the Indo-Pacific region. So one very important idea is that as the Indo-Pacific region is taking shape, Taiwan is becoming more and more important and is becoming an important beneficiary. Not because the Indo-Pacific is perceived to be drawn against China, but the fact that the Indo-Pacific believes in an open, rules-based and an inclusive regional order. So this is Taiwan's participation is very important on several counts. One, because the region is designed to maintain a rules-based order, then Taiwan's participation as an entity that is geographically located in the region is important. Then rules-based Indo-Pacific should definitely include Taiwan. Then my second point here is that the idea of the Indo-Pacific is inclusive. Saying that the Indo-Pacific is inclusive, it also aims to include even China. In fact, if we see the documents by Indo-Pacific documents by Germany, by other European countries, they have tried to include China if China becomes a responsible stakeholder. So, but what we have seen is that there's no enthusiasm from the Chinese side. So I believe in such a circumstances, Taiwan can actually play an important role. And during the COVID-19 crisis, with its limited exposure, Taiwan projected itself as an alternative to the idea of the PRC. Then I believe that it can play an important role. And so on one hand, we can see that there is China that is authoritarian. It hides information and has been to a great extent responsible for the pandemic. But on the other hand, you have Taiwan, which is a democracy, has dealt with the problem fairly and has been transparent. And also it has been keen on supporting other countries in the fight against the pandemic. So the cooperation in the age of the pandemic is just not based on self-interest, but Taiwan policy has also been inclusive. So my third point is that the Indo-Pacific is open. So the idea of the Indo-Pacific is that it is open to any country that could contribute in ensuring the stability and the regional order in Asia is prevalent here. And these new realities are that Taiwan's contribution and experience are included in the rules-based order. And I think in this context, Taiwan's participation would only strengthen the idea of the Indo-Pacific. So it is important to include Taiwan in this mechanism so that it can further stabilize the idea of the Indo-Pacific. And its participation is welcome not only for its own international credibility, but also for making the Indo-Pacific order more credible and more open. But here the question is that how do we achieve Taiwan's greater participation in this region? And I believe to make Indo-Pacific truly inclusive, Taiwan's participation should be encouraged not only by the US, but also by countries such as India and Australia. Now, coming to India and Taiwan, Taiwan has a strong military, advanced economy, and its policies have been inclusive. And COVID-19 has proven this beyond doubt. And if India does not engage it now and continues to overlook its potential, it will be a missed opportunity for India, but also it will be a loss for both. So to conclude, I will say that what the two sides should keep in mind is that the relations can move forward without impacting their respective ties with China. And time is ripe to push for greater cooperation between the two countries. And this is more significant when the US is also advocating and working towards providing Taiwan a greater voice at the international platform. And we are seeing, as Professor Deepa also said, that there is continuity in Biden administration vis-a-vis Taiwan. Being like-minded democracies and having similar goals, to have comprehensive relationship, it is important for both sides to have multidimensional approach towards each other, and multidimensional cooperation should be encouraged by both India and Taiwan. I stop here and I welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sana. You presented a very difficult, complex kind of relationship, but still leaving lots of room for cooperation. So thank you. And now let's move to Jennifer, who will be giving us an overview of relations with Taiwan from Australia and New Zealand. You've got a lot to cover, so you're on.
All right, thanks so much, Deepa, for inviting me to participate on this panel and also for arranging this webinar. So I'll be focusing on Taiwan's relations with Australia and New Zealand within the broader context of the recent downturn in China-Australia relations. So from Taiwan's perspective, Australia and New Zealand are two key trade partners in Western democracies that have close security ties with the United States. As the Taipei Act of 2019 points out, Taiwan's relations with Australia and other countries such as Japan and India are of significant benefit in strengthening Taiwan's economy and preserving its international space. New Zealand and to a greater extent Australia are what Taipei considers like-minded countries and important regional players to incorporate into a regional democracy bandwagon that is united to deter Chinese expansionism. So in line with the Trump administration's positions on regional issues, Australia and New Zealand have spoken out against the mistreatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang and Beijing's national security law for Hong Kong. And for Taipei, these are signs that these US allies are committed to upholding human rights and democracy, even if doing so irritates the Chinese government. Australia and New Zealand also have been longtime supporters of Taiwan's participation in the World Health Organization and other international organizations that don't require statehood. So right now, Taipei is lending Australia moral support and discussing ways to boost economic cooperation as Australia-China relations are experiencing significant turbulence. Both countries are currently locked in a bitter trade and political dispute. And in December of last year, Taiwan's legislative yuan bought 200 bottles of Australian wine, which they called Freedom Wine, to express solidarity for Australia as it faces intense pressure from Beijing to change its anti-China policies. And this gesture was meant to lend support for a campaign organized by the Interparliamentarian Alliance on China, which has urged people around the world to stand together against Chinese strong arming by purchasing Australian wine. Over the past year, China has slapped tariffs on $20 billion worth of Australian exports, including barley, beef, and wine, and also has bans on lobsters, tin, and coal in apparent retaliation for Australia's anti-China behavior, which included calling for an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19 last April. So this has been a huge blow to Australia's export economy, given that China is its largest trade partner and a major consumer of Australian goods that are now subject to tariffs. In November of last year, the Chinese embassy in Australia actually sent a list of 14 grievances to an Australian media company. And the list of complaints included criticism of Australia's foreign interference laws and restrictions on Huawei from the rollout of 5G technology. It also pointed to Australia's incessant interference in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan affairs, as well as statements on the South China Sea and accusations against China on cyber attacks. And all of these statements were seen by the Chinese as Australia siding with the United States and participating in an anti-China smear campaign. The Chinese have argued that Australia has to change its policies on this list for bilateral relations to resume at the ministerial and leader level, and talks at these levels were frozen by the Chinese. But Australian politicians have pushed back against these Chinese demands, arguing that their nation's sovereignty was at stake. It's very apparent that Beijing is trying to teach Australia a lesson for taking such actions that go against the grain of China's agenda. Beijing views the U.S. as the policeman in the region, and it views Australia as the U.S.'s deputy. And oftentimes Australia is referred to as the deputy sheriff in Chinese media. And China also calculates that it's much easier to attack a middle-sized U.S. ally than the United States itself. So it's clear that Beijing is exerting tremendous pressure on Australia to also send a message to other U.S. allies and partners in the region, such as Japan and India, that it will utilize various tools and tactics to achieve its objectives. Taipei empathizes with what Australia has to deal with simply because they are both targets of Chinese pressure, but also because Taipei wants Australian support for its own struggles against China. You often see Taiwan's government raising the issue of Hong Kong in its public meetings with Australian representatives because it has seen how Australia has spoken out for the pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong. And Taipei is trying to raise the banner of shared democratic values to create an ideological motive for regional democracies to unite and collectively stand up against Chinese pressure. So while Australia is in a difficult position right now, wedged between China and the United States, if it were to make more substantive policy changes, that would, it's really difficult for it to make substantive policy changes that would benefit Taipei's situation. Nonetheless, one promising area of cooperation or opportunity that has arisen from the China-Australia trade tensions is closer economic cooperation between Taiwan and Australia. Currently, Scott Morrison's government is looking for alternate export markets for its billions of dollars of goods hit by China's tariff markets. So Taiwan is Australia's 6th largest export market, and it could become one such alternate market. Both sides have been discussing ways to boost Australian exports to Taiwan and to enhance bilateral trade. However, there does not seem to be any desire on Australia's part to work towards a free trade agreement with Taipei, particularly right now, since that would only inflame already thick tensions with China. On the other hand, Taiwan has a free trade agreement with New Zealand, and there's concern that because both Australia and New Zealand's exports tend to be agricultural products and also wine, that Australia's exports would be relatively less competitive given that Taiwan and New Zealand have an FTA in place. So moving on to New Zealand, Taiwan has close economic and trade ties, although it pales in comparison to Taiwan's trade with Australia. Last year, Taiwan-New Zealand trade reached around 1 billion compared to Taiwan-Australian trade that stood at around 11 billion. And Taiwan is New Zealand's 7th largest export market, while New Zealand is a major dairy supplier and provider of agricultural goods to Taiwan. So both sides have bonded during the COVID-19 pandemic, and New Zealand officials have publicly touted Taiwan's success story in combating the first wave of the COVID-19 outbreak and backing Taiwan's readmission as an observer to the WHO. And I would contrast this with Beijing's behavior during the early months of the coronavirus, when it withheld deliveries of PPE equipment to New Zealand in apparent retaliation for New Zealand excluding Huawei from the country's 5G network. Between Australia and New Zealand, Taipei has more expectations for Australia, given that it's a bigger regional power, but it's also because Australia is much more aligned with the US Indo-Pacific strategy, whereas New Zealand has tried to avoid excessive reliance on either the US and China so that it could maintain its independence and security. So New Zealand has taken a less confrontational approach towards China and is not facing the kind of heat from Beijing that Australia is currently experiencing. Right now, Australia is under intense pressure from Beijing to tone down its public support of Taiwan, such as supporting its participation in the WHO. At the same time, the Biden administration's evolving stance on Taiwan could create additional pressure on Australia to uphold US interests in the region, which would likely expose Australia to even more Chinese pressure. So ultimately, the Australian government will need to decide where it comes down between the two powers, which will in turn affect the potential room for growth in its relations with Taiwan. So in any case, Taipei should seize on the economic and trade openings created by the China-Australia trade spat to further strengthen relations with Australia. It's clear that the US cannot pursue and implement its foreign policy interests in the Indo-Pacific alone, so it really needs to support regional partners, including Australia, New Zealand, Japan, India, and other countries to strengthen Taiwan's economy and to preserve its international space. And this is why I think today's panel is very timely and relevant. So I'll stop here and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for giving us an overview of two important countries in Taiwan. And with that, now let me turn to another important country in the region, Japan. And we have Mike Mochizuki to tell us about that. Mike?
Thank you very much, Deepa. I want to join my fellow panelists in thanking you for organizing this very timely panel. What I'd like to do tonight is to first start by focusing on four important positives in the relationship between Japan and Taiwan, and then turn to two challenges in Japan-Taiwan relations, and then finally end with a couple comments about the Japan-China-Taiwan strategic triangle and the Japan, China, Taiwan, US strategic quadrangle. First, in terms of the positives, I wanted to underscore the positive mutual perceptions that exist between Japanese and the people of Taiwan. Periodically, there are public opinion surveys taken in both Taiwan and in Japan, and what they consistently show is that Japanese have very positive views of Taiwan, and the people of Taiwan have very positive views of Japan. For example, in a 2018 survey conducted in Taiwan, 59% of the respondents stated that Japan was the country they liked the most. So Japan came out on top as the country that Taiwan liked or admired the most. Coming in second was China at 8%, and then a distant third was the United States at 4%, raising some questions about how powerful is US soft power. When you look at it in terms of attitudes of the Japanese towards Taiwan, a survey conducted in November 2019 showed that 55% of the Japanese stated that of all of the countries in Asia, they had the feeling of greatest affinity towards Taiwan. So just like in Taiwan, when Japan came out on top in terms of perceptions, in Japan, Taiwan was ranked at the top. And one of the reasons for this, especially in Japan, was that the Japanese were very impressed, were quite moved by the generous aid that Taiwan provided to Japan in the wake of the March 2011 earthquake and tsunami. Taiwan was one of the largest aid givers to Japan. They gave $240 million in terms of aid. And over the last 2 decades, the amount of two-way tourism between Japan and Taiwan has just grown. And this people-to-people interaction has reinforced the positive views that Japanese have towards Taiwan, and people on Taiwan have towards Japan. And then just kind of one indicator of this kind of sense of affinity is that President Tsai Ing-wen regularly tweets directly to the Japanese people in Japanese. And this is something that is quite appreciated by Japanese fans of Taiwan. The other big positive in Japan-Taiwan relations is, of course, the economic relationship. The economic relationship between Japan and Taiwan has been long-standing, but they are very important trading partners for each other. For Japan, Taiwan is the 4th largest market for Japanese exports after China, the United States, and South Korea. And Taiwan is the 5th largest source of imports for Japan after China, the United States, Australia, and South Korea. And for Taiwan, Japan is the 4th largest export destination and the 2nd largest source of imports. Also, Japan is the 4th largest foreign direct investor in Taiwan. And so increasingly, the economic relationship has become tighter. And over the last decade, Japan and Taiwan have negotiated a number of very important bilateral economic agreements that cover the areas of investment, e-commerce, taxation, customs cooperation and mutual assistance, and trade of organic foods. A third kind of positive in Japan-Taiwan relations is what I would call a cautious, incremental upgrading of diplomatic interactions over the last decade. One indicator of this was what happened in 2016 after the election of Tsai Ing-wen as president of the Republic of China. Prime Minister Abe at the time kind of broke precedents and sent President-elect Tsai a personal congratulatory note. And then President Tsai reciprocated that when Prime Minister Abe's Liberal Democratic Party won the general election in Japan held in October 2017. Another kind of indicator of this incremental upgrading of diplomatic interactions was the name change of the major organization that represents Japan's interest in Taiwan. Previously, it had this kind of awkward name of the Interchange Association. The name of that association was formally changed to the Japan-Taiwan Exchange Association, and this caused some criticism from Beijing. Another development on the diplomatic front took place in spring 2017 when the Parliamentary Vice Minister of Internal Affairs and Communications, Mr. Akama, or Akama Jiro, visited Taiwan under the name of promoting tourism. Mr. Akama was the highest ranking Japanese official ever to visit Taiwan, an incumbent official, after Japan severed formal diplomatic relations with the Republic of China on Taiwan in September 1972. Also, there is now a members group that supports relations with Taiwan. It's known as the Japan Republic of China Diet Members Consultative Council. And in January 2020, a delegation of this council visited Taiwan and met with President Tsai Ing-wen. And then in November 2020, this council publicly endorsed Taiwan's participation in the World Health Assembly and urged the Japanese government to push for Taiwan participation in the World Health Assembly. Another indicator of this was when former President Lee Teng-hui passed away this past summer, and Japan sent the former Prime Minister Modi to visit Taiwan to pay respects to Lee Teng-hui. And while he was in Taiwan, he visited Tsai Ing-wen, and he seemed to have indicated before going that possibly the new Japanese Prime Minister Suga might be open to a phone call with Tsai Ing-wen, and if that were to take place, that would have been a further development. But what's very interesting about this episode is that according to certain media support reports, Tokyo assured Beijing that such a phone call would not take place, between the new Prime Minister Suga and President Tsai Ing-wen. And then President Tsai herself indicated that she had no plans to speak directly on the phone with Prime Minister Suga. Finally, the fourth area in which I think relations between Taiwan and Japan are on the positive side is that the two sides have managed relatively well potential contentious issues, because there are issues that divide Japan and Taiwan. And one, of course, is the territorial issue. The Republic of China, just like the People's Republic of China, contest Japan's sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands, or the known in Chinese as the Diaoyu Islands. But after the September 2012 nationalization crisis that really caused a crisis in Japan-China relations, the government of Taiwan moved, and this was under Ma Ying-jeou, moved to negotiate a fisheries agreement in the waters adjacent to the disputed islands, and that fisheries agreement was finalized in April 2013. And that kind of diffused the frictions between Taiwan and Japan about the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. Now, there's still a little bit of dissatisfaction among local fishermen, especially those in Okinawa, but this was a case of the two sides working to de-escalate the problems on the territorial dispute. Also, Taiwan, along with China and the Republic of Korea, disputes Japan's very dubious exclusive economic zone claim that used Morishima as the base for demarcating an EEZ that goes out 200 nautical miles. And in fact, a Taiwan fishing boat was kind of trying to test the Japanese on this, and Japan detained a Taiwan fishing boat. And this could, certainly have led to a crisis, but both Japan and Taiwan decided to diffuse tensions, and they agreed to a search and rescue agreement in the area. There are also some historical issues. The comfort women issue is alive in Taiwan. There is a museum that commemorates what Taiwanese called Japanese sexual slavery. And on top of that, in August 2018, there was a comfort woman statue that was erected in Tainan City, and this caused frictions, and the Japanese government lodged a formal complaint. But unlike the situation in Japan and South Korea, both Tokyo and Taipei have really gone to some length to avoid the kind of escalation of tensions that you see between Seoul and Tokyo. So those are the kind of four positives in Japan-Taiwan relations. But I think there are two very important challenges. One is about security, Taiwan security. And I would say this is one of the most sensitive diplomatic issues for Japan. Japan, of course, given its geographic position, has a keen interest in avoiding a military conflict. But at the same time, there are many in Japan, for strategic reasons, who would prefer the status quo, meaning the continuation of the separation of Taiwan and China. So although Japan adheres to its version of a one China policy, in which they recognize the PRC as the sole legal government of China, and they have no intention of kind of standing in the way of a peaceful process of reunification, there is no question that many in Japan would prefer the status quo of a separation between Taiwan and China. Now, the Japanese, in a U.S.-Japan joint statement, has expressed an interest in a peaceful management and resolution of the Taiwan question. But at the same time, Japan has not made an explicit and formal commitment to Taiwan's defense. In fact, Japan has staked out an ambiguous position about whether or not Japan would actually support the United States and Taiwan if there were a military conflict. Now, there are some in Japan that would like Japan to move away from its version of strategic ambiguity to more clarity. There are some on the right that advocate that Japan pass a law that mandates the parameters of Japan's relations with Taiwan comparable to the U.S.-Taiwan Relations Act. The current Deputy Defense Minister has, in fact, called publicly on President Biden to establish some clear red lines and for the United States to move towards a position of strategic clarity. But nevertheless, I would say that there is still not enough support in Japan to push Japan in this direction towards kind of strategic clarity in terms of the defense of Taiwan. And the reason for this is Japan has a huge economic and security stake with China. And so given Japan's current interest in stabilizing and improving relations with China, I doubt that Japan is going to move in this direction. And so for the time being, I believe that Japan is going to focus on the defense of the offshore islands in the Southwest Island chain. And given their geographic location, Japan can defend those islands, and that might help in the Taiwan contingency. Finally, in terms of the regional economic engagement, Japan would prefer Taiwan to be fully integrated in various regional economic processes, but China has been a constraint. China has effectively blocked Taiwan from joining RCEP unless Taiwan is willing to negotiate on the basis of the one China principle, and Taiwan is unwilling to do that. So now the salient issue is the possibility of Taiwan joining the CPTPP. But the problem here is that there is a stumbling block. Taiwan would have to lift its ban on food imports from areas affected by the Fukushima nuclear disaster. So let me just end with my closing on the Japan, China, Taiwan's strategic triangle and the quadrangle when you include the United States. And I think to a certain extent, as relations between Japan and China deteriorate and relations between China and Taiwan deteriorate, there are strong strategic incentives for Japan and Taiwan to draw closer together. And I think that's been the kind of general trend over the last decade. But I think this dynamic operates only up to a point, because Japan still has a keen interest in stable relations with China for both security and economic relations. So paradoxically, I believe that if you want to have a fuller expansion and deepening and Taiwan relations, that would only happen in the context of an improvement in China-Japan relations, and even in an improvement in China-Taiwan relations. And then finally, in terms of the strategic quadrangle, if the U.S.-China rivalry intensifies and the Taiwan issue is the key driver of this rivalry, there will be intense pressures from the United States on Japan to play a more prominent role in U.S. military strategies against China to deal with Taiwan. But this would put Japan in a severe strategic dilemma. It would derail the current rapprochement and Sino-Japanese relations. And so therefore, I think in the long run and in a general strategic sense, Japan has an interest in tension reduction and restraint regarding the Taiwan issue. And this will be one of the biggest diplomatic challenges for Japan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, for doing a kind of an audit of positives and challenges in the Japan-Taiwan relationship. Thanks to all of you for providing really great perspectives on all these different countries that have their own pressures and their own foreign policy drivers when it comes to Taiwan. I want to just go back, if I will, for the next few minutes. I want to take the opportunity to have a conversation with you all. And let me start with directing something at all of you, the same question. And that is to pick up where Mike left off, but to go further into it. And that is the possibility and the opportunities for delinking, perhaps is maybe a strong word, but at least separating out or having parallel relations with the countries you're talking about vis-a-vis China and Taiwan. Sana talked about the fact that India had been trying that to some extent, actually not, and downplaying Taiwan, but was not getting anything out of it. They're kind of self-restrained. My question to you all is, how much in terms of net benefit do you see in self-restraint and in terms of, and foregone sort of opportunities vis-a-vis Taiwan, and especially when you look ahead trending what we've seen happening in 2020, and not at all clear that China is really, whatever you do with Taiwan, that they have their own strategic interest they're going to push no matter what. So let's go back perhaps and start with Sana and work backwards again.
Thank you, Professor Deep. This is the most relevant question that you have asked. How do you manage relationship with Taiwan and China at the same time? How do we have parallel ties with Taiwan and China? So this has been the policy of Taiwan's administration. So India has been cautious, and I think this is one of the reasons why Taiwan government pushes for that. But how do we achieve that? This is the question. And how beneficial it is for the Indian administration to So I believe that India has to take cues from countries such as Japan and Singapore. US-Taiwan, I won't say because it's a unique relationship. So we can't really emulate the US-Taiwan model for India-Taiwan relationship. But India can certainly learn from the countries that are in the region, such as Singapore and Japan. And Professor Mike has already talked about how the relationship has grown significantly over the years. So I think there is so much scope if we learn from other countries. And if I may talk about the benefits of having ties, of it's worth jeopardizing ties with China, because China is going to condemn whatever interaction India is going to have with Taiwan. And we have seen that in the past with respect to economic interaction, with respect to the parliamentary delegation visit, China has responded strongly when it comes to India. So I believe one benefit would be that especially during the COVID time, we have seen how Taiwan has responded. And on its own, without any exposure, any interaction with the WHO, and without being a part of any high level interaction. So I believe we really need to learn from Taiwan's best practices, and we could have contained the pandemic if Taiwan is also included in high level interaction, because I have been sitting in Taiwan. I saw what Taiwan and how Taiwan has done. And it's so remarkable. I'm in awe of what Taiwan has done with the pandemic. So I believe there's so much to learn from Taiwan best practices. And second, how can we achieve parallel ties? I believe that all these countries, as I also mentioned during my presentation, that all these countries need to come together. All these countries have shared interests and concerns. And it's just not China. It's just not China's aggression. We have seen that countries are dealing with non-traditional security threats as well. So to deal with the traditional as well as the non-traditional security threat, all the countries need to come together and advocate for Taiwan's greater participation, and they need to include Taiwan in their official deliberations. So one way to do that is that Japan, US, and Taiwan, they already have GCTF, the Global Cooperation and Training Framework. So why not expand it and include countries such as India and Australia and maybe New Zealand, maybe the new Southbound country, Singapore. So I think that would be a good start. And it would be under the purview of one China policy. I think what these countries need to keep in mind, that since all these countries adhere to one China policy, we need to find ways that it doesn't really jeopardize their ties, their respective ties with China. And I think this is what Taiwan wants. Taiwan is in a very critical situation with respect to China. Even Taiwan doesn't want to provoke China at this moment. So I think countries need to find a way to deal with elevating ties with Taiwan so that it really doesn't impact their respective equations with China.
Thank you very much. And I want to point out that India right now this year is the chair of the executive board of the World Health Organization, so that it has some unique responsibility and possibility there in terms of Taiwan's participation. Jennifer, Australia in particular has been under increasing pressure and is playing a very, in some sense, perhaps a little bit of a dangerous game, but it is managing in some sense fairly well so far. And so is there any lesson for what is possible from the recent events between Australia and China, and anything we can extrapolate for relations with Taiwan?
Sure. So I think, as I mentioned before, China's really trying to teach Australia a lesson. And this really stems from Australia's role as a US ally in the region. There's a sense among Chinese commentators that, Australia has done many, a list of things critical of China, and this has basically been viewed as very disrespectful to the Chinese. So just as the Chinese had made a lesson out of South Korea, for example, over the THAAD issue, I really feel that China's trying to hit at Australia, but also send a message to other allies in the region, U.S. allies, U.S. partners in the region, such as, Japan and India, that if you do choose to jump on this U.S. bandwagon of constantly criticizing China, trying to contain China, these are going to be the repercussions. China is and I think China has been actually successful because, unfortunately, over the years, Australia has become so dependent on the Chinese economy. China is its largest trade partner, and 30% of its exports actually go to China. And given that Australia is an export, dependent economy, this has really been a blow to Australia. So I think going forward, Australia is looking at the Biden administration's policies, and it's really just stuck between the two superpowers. I think from the Australian perspective, it's much better in its national interest if the U.S. and China can resolve the differences, because as long as the U.S. is pushing a hard line on Australia, and Australia decides to, echo U.S. statements, join in military exercises, for example, in the South China Sea, that would just further expose Australia to even more Chinese pressure. And China could, for example, go after, take a much more harder punch against its coal exports, which China is a major consumer of. So I think the implications for Taiwan is that it's just very difficult right now for Australia to make any sort of substantive policy changes. At one point, there was an Australian member of parliament who said, Australia should recognize Taiwan, but it came in the context of getting back at China. So we really don't want, Taiwan to be played as a card in this, China-Australia spat. But I think, as I mentioned before, in terms of non-formal relations, informal ties like economic and trade, I think there are opportunities for Taiwan and Australia to work together.
I think what you're describing is the difficult position of a middle power and the room that it does not really have often. And Mike, turning to you, of course, Japan has been very much of a leader in supply chain resiliency and responding to the what has been exposed in the pandemic and the oversupply of overconcentration of supply chains in China. And I wonder to what extent that Japan in the economic realm, but also really economic security, would be willing to take a lead in including not just Australia and US, but also other partners like India, Taiwan, and so forth. Do you see that, or Singapore, as Sana mentioned, but do you see that as a possible way forward that could serve a bigger purpose than just pure economics?
I think right now, Japan is in an optimal position. And so if anything, what is driving Japan's thinking is how to preserve this optimality. Now, of course, Japan, like any other country, wants to diversify its supply chains away from China. But the reality is that the Chinese economy is so dynamic and so large that Japan does not want to decouple and move away from China. So to the extent that they will want to expand supply chains, it's not to kind of reduce the integration with the Chinese economy, but it's an add-on to that. So I think at the end of the day, Japan has benefited enormously from its policy of restraint. It's reaped all the economic and political benefits of the deepening relationship with Taiwan, and it has minimized the risks of that relationship with China and maximized the benefits of the Sino-Japanese kind of economic integration. And so the real danger is is not to kind of expand this, but I think that the real danger is the increasing militarization of the U.S.-China rivalry and the prospect of a serious crisis on the Taiwan Strait. And so Japan, over the next decade, will face this really moment of truth about, can Japan do anything to moderate the rivalry between the United States and China? And that's a tall order. And I think that it's a very hard diplomatic task, but the only choice that I see is for Japan to be what I would call a leading middle power and try to create an diplomatic and political infrastructure on the periphery of China that is a force of moderation, so that they can kind of moderate this rivalry between China and the United States.
Just follow up on that. But in this case, you have an assumption that Chinese are willing to be moderate in their own tactics and strategy, and the kind of strategic positioning they're doing can in fact be affected by countries like Japan. If you pull back even further, that's the what I would also can point out is that if you look at the China-India relationship, that has not been the case. I think India felt very much the way that Japan did. I think there was a sharing of that, but I think the last year or so, I see a big shift that's partly to do with China's own change in what appears to be a more assertive approach, strategically speaking. So, all right, we do have a few questions and I want to get to that. So we'll probably circle back to some of these same issues, but thank you to the audience for being patient. Let me see what we've got some questions here. The first one is from Stephen Zhu from Duke University, and I think it's directed to all of you. And you've touched on this again, but I think again this is a question that is not easily answered. So we're going to get it asked a number of different ways. But the question is, to what extent will efforts by India, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, what will efforts by these countries to strengthen public and/or economic exchanges with Taiwan, will it invite a retaliation from China, or are there, I suppose, ways in which you can either avoid it or soften that? But are we held hostage, really, in some sense, to this? And what's your own assessment of that? Who'd like to? It's open to all of you.
I can start. So the thing is, as I've already mentioned, that what India and other countries need to focus on is that how can we strengthen cooperation with Taiwan under the purview of one China policy. So that because India strictly adheres one China policy, and as I mentioned that nothing much has changed on the ground despite having problems with China, despite having a protracted boundary dispute. So in fact, it's not that China hasn't really retaliated, or China hasn't really opposed any interaction between India and Taiwan. So we saw in 2011 when, in fact, it came from India, the proposal came from India that India and Taiwan should have a free trade agreement, and we have a feasibility study. And at that point of time, Kuomintang was in power, and so Taiwan wasn't very keen on having an economic mechanism arrangement with India. But we saw a statement from the Chinese side, and even in 2017, and that I also mentioned during my presentation, that from 2017 and 2020, I would say that there has been a limited interaction between India and Taiwan. And the reason was that in 2017, the visit by the all-women parliamentary delegation generated response from the Chinese side, and there were articles in Global Times, and we know that it's government position, it's the mouthpiece of the CCP, and there were articles in the Global Times and about the, and then the title was, and the title and the description was that India is playing with fire by interacting with Taiwan. So China hasn't really done much, if you ask me, in terms of escalation when it comes to Taiwan, because India has also been cautious with Taiwan. And then we saw that there was the parliamentary India-Taiwan Parliamentary Friendship Association was playing low-key, and recently it was revived, and we saw a meeting that took place in Taiwan in 2020 November that was also because of this unprecedented enthusiasm and support for Taiwan. So it's not that China is not going to respond or retaliate when India moves towards Taiwan. But what these countries, and specifically India, needs to make clear that we are cooperating with Taiwan under the framework of One China policy. We can go ahead and have cooperation in the areas such as economics and culture. So the problem China has, and China should have, if countries adhere to One China policy, if countries go ahead and have robust defense ties, which I think countries should go ahead and have security ties with Taiwan, because Taiwan has expertise in cyber attacks. And I think, and this is what I've written in several of my pieces, that India really needs to have a policy planning dialogue and maybe a dialogue in cyber security as well. But as I said, that even economic exchanges have been limited, and these countries need to have advanced public diplomacy towards each other. So I believe that it's not the time for both sides to think about China, because as I said, China is also not paying any heed to India's territorial concerns. And Taiwan has been at the receiving end of China's aggression for a very, very long time. So these countries really need to think about their own interest. And this is why I say that engaging Taiwan is in India's best interest right now. And if you look at China has been cooperating with Pakistan. And one of the reasons for cooperating with Pakistan is to keep India intact in the region. So I think when India is kind of rethinking its Taiwan policy, it's important that all these factors should be taken into consideration when there's a rethink on China and Taiwan policy in India.
Okay. Anyone want to add anything?
I can add.
Right.
I think in terms of normal trade, China is not opposed to Taiwan's normal trade with Australia or New Zealand. But one caveat is trying to reach a free trade agreement between Taiwan and Australia. And really, there were plans to make some movement on this issue, especially after China had negotiated its own free trade agreement with Australia in 2015. But it was reported that between 2016 and 2017, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi had told the Australians very clearly that it did not want Australia to enter into any sort of formal trade agreement with Taiwan because Tsai Ing-wen came to power. And so it was reported in Australian media that, the Australians acquiesced. And right now it's just not on the table. But I would contrast that with Taiwan's free trade agreement with New Zealand, which was actually negotiated during the Ma Ying-jeou administration. So you really see how the cross-strait relations does play a factor into whether or not Beijing will allow Taiwan to enter into another formal trade agreement with another country.
Okay, and the other thing I wanted to add was, given the tremendous public profile, positive public profile that Taiwan has gained over the last year, Mike, does that give any opening for countries like Japan to do more?
Well, fundamentally, it would have to kind of go back to Japan's way of managing the tensions between the United States and China, and they were caught between these two powers. And Japan pursued this interest by pursuing a policy of separating politics and economics, and I think that's the way to go. And so, it seems paradoxical, but if Taiwan wants more space in the international community and wants to be integrated into kind of the region in terms of regional institutions and processes. Ironically, you're not going to get that with the intensification of US-China rivalry over Taiwan. The only way you're going to get that is if there is an improvement in US-China relations, Japan-China relations, and a reduction of tensions between China and Taiwan. And so the current path is not a path that is going to lead to a better outcome for Taiwan. And so that's why I kind of disagree with some of the current trends. I mean, it only goes so far. But if Taiwan wants to be part of RCEP, if Taiwan wants to be part of TPP, that means Sino-Japanese relations have to improve, US-China relations have to improve, and there have.
Mike, actually, there's a related question for you. And this comes from Gerrit van der Wies. And it says, he's asking whether or not Japan perceives Chinese aggressiveness and encroachment on issues like the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands dispute in and of itself, or does it view Chinese aggressiveness in a broader context in terms of the overall approach that Beijing, that I mentioned, is maybe taking against other partners like India, Australia, Hong Kong, and other partners? And is Japan likely to respond along bilateral lines, Japan-China, or is it would it look to a broader coalition and pushing back against China? It's a very pointed question.
Yeah, yes. Well, first of all, opinion is divided in Japan, and there are some that see China as having a grand hegemonic design to be predominant in the region and to drive the United States out and basically call all the shots, in the region. And so therefore, the only way to deal with that is to push back very hard and to contain China. But there are still others that think that it is still possible to come up with a certain amount of stability. And that's based on a combination of deterrence and reassurance. And so, over the last 10 years, I think there's been a lot of focus on the deterrence side and not enough on the reassurance side. But ultimately, Japan, if there's a change in relative power, it's the relative decline of Japan vis-a-vis China. And so it is impossible to think that Japan can come up with a realistic strategy to deal with China just bilaterally. And that's why there's every incentive in Japan to develop a coalition. But it's not a coalition that is a hard containment strategy. It's a coalition that maintains a dialogue and engagement, and in a sense, kind of reassures China on the fundamental issues, but then provides space for other countries to develop and not necessarily be under the thumb of China.
Okay, thank you. Another question is from Tina Chang, Voice of America, and she's directing it to all panelists. But it is a question, again, that we have seen elements of in your answers already. But she's asking, looking at the Biden administration, it's recently made statements affirming its, quote, rock solid commitments to Taiwan. It's recently sent warships to transit through the Taiwan Strait as freedom of navigation expressions. Now, her question is, how do the different partners in the region view this reaffirmation of U.S. position on Taiwan? And do you think they'll align themselves with the U.S. organized freedom of navigation operations, the FONOPs, that the U.S. has been doing? I know that India has been very, very reluctant on this, but what about the others? And of course, this brings in the question of how much importance do these regional countries give to United States policy at any given point in time towards supporting Taiwan? Does that make a difference, the level of support U.S. gives to Taiwan? Not necessarily China, leaving China aside. Jennifer, you want to add as one of the treaty allies, Japan?
Right. So Biden did have a phone call with Morrison, and they did talk about China. And I think Morrison also invoked kind of the ANZUS Treaty, saying that the 70th anniversary of the ANZUS Treaty was coming up. I think that I think that Australia has supported kind of the U.S. Freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. And then it said that on the situation of Taiwan, that it was observing the situation and the developments. So I think it really depends on the Biden administration and how it will, approach China. I think, as I mentioned before, Australia would prefer Biden to take a less confrontational approach on China, just because doing so would also relieve a lot of pressure on Australia. And, from Australia's national interests, having this trade relationship with China is very important. So I would say that in comparison, I think New Zealand actually has more flexibility. It has done this similar things as Australia in terms of taking positions on, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, also supporting Taiwan's WHO membership, but it has gotten less slack. And I think that, China's strategy is actually to divide the two. And New Zealand's also looking at how Australia is doing under Chinese pressure. And I think it sees that it's better that it's Australia and not New Zealand. And New Zealand also has said it wants to kind of arrange a truce, a trade truce between China and Australia. So I think that, the alliance needs to be strengthened, but also, seeing how Beijing has really been able to deeply penetrate into Australia and into New Zealand. And this does create somewhat of a rift in terms of continuity and cohesiveness for the U.S. position in the region.
Okay. Mike, do you want to say anything about phone ops? I know you're.
Okay, well, in terms of phone ops, I firmly believe that U.S. Naval vessels should sail wherever international law allows, and they should just do it on a routine basis. But I personally am against this notion of phone op operations as kind of your in-your-face sort of behavior. Which just exacerbates tension. So I'm all for freedom of navigation, and I'm also all for U.S. naval ships going where they're allowed to go. Just do it, but don't make it into such a big deal and call it fawn ops. I mean, that's totally unnecessary, and it just exacerbates tensions.
Sana, do you want to? There are two more questions here quickly for you. So I'm going to perhaps move to that, since we only have just a couple of minutes left, if you don't mind. One question is that in the same way that China, this comes from Jonathan Shea, the same way that China maintains diplomatic relations with North and South Korea in order to serve its own foreign policy interests, would it not be in India's best interest to shift away from a strict one China policy where it has very little room for maneuver? It's a nice analogy here in some sense.
Yeah, but actually I won't compare China's relationship with North Korea and India's relationship with Taiwan, because first, North Korea is recognized by a lot more countries than countries recognize Taiwan. First is this. And if you look at China and North Korea relationship, this relationship is sometimes described as relationship between lips and teeth. So this is not the equation between India and China, India and Taiwan. So I believe that we really have to see it in different context. But as as the question is that if China goes ahead and cooperates or engages country on the basis of its own interest, why doesn't India do it? So this is what China has been doing with Pakistan. And if we look at the CP, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and this is one of the major reservations India has against the BRI, that it passes through the disputed territory between India and Pakistan. So if China is not paying heed to India's territorial sensitivities, not only with its own territorial dispute with India, but also the dispute between India and Pakistan, so India should also go ahead and talk about elevating ties with Taiwan. But as I mentioned in my presentation, that if India does that, that would be like using Taiwan as a card. So I think Taiwan's utility should just not be limited to using Taiwan as a card. And I believe when we talk about Trump administration, if I may also answer a question, answer to the previous question, that though there were a lot of actions when we talk about Trump-Taiwan policy, but I think those were all provocative action, and Trump was kind of using Taiwan as a card. But I don't see this happening in Biden administration. I think there are quieter actions than words here, and I believe that there's a lot of relief in Taiwan. There were a lot of speculations when there was this transition, but there's a relief in Taiwan. But I believe there's also relief in India. Quadrilateral dialogue is going to be there, and no matter what, the Indo-Pacific is led by the US. So if US is not going to be proactive, then I think it's going to be faded away. So I think there's this relief, and India is kind of happy that there's continuity with respect to China, US-China policy. And so what I believe that what Trump didn't do with Taiwan is that it didn't encourage US didn't encourage other countries to include Taiwan in their official deliberations, bilateral talks. So I think this is what Biden administration could do differently and encourage countries to include Taiwan and to elevate ties with Taiwan.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good note to end on because we're actually a little bit over time. Engagement, I think the point is to find different ways and more ways of engagement with Taiwan, especially with US and regional partner support. So I'm sorry, there were other questions that we simply couldn't get to, but I don't want to keep anybody later than 9:30 here in Washington, D.C. We're already pressing our luck here. I want to say that I think we're off to an excellent start with our first Taiwan Roundtable of 2021. Thank you to all of my panelists who gave excellent presentations, very difficult subject because there are no easy answers, and we all want to know what the next steps are, what the easy steps are. There is none. However, I think what I heard is that there's a certain upward trajectory in this relationship toward Taiwan, in part because of 2020 and the events that we're facing right now. So on that note, you can, to the audience, thank you for being tremendous audience, being patient, and for your questions. You can watch this webinar in its recording on YouTube and the Sigur Center channel, and hope to see you back soon. Meanwhile, goodbye, good night, good morning. Bye-bye.